Yes, who's come on now. So Kathy, if you'd like to, so Kathy is from Ricardo Energy, and she'll be presenting on the new Environmental Protection Act 2018 and the new General Environmental Duty, which come into place on the 1st of July 2021. So Kathy, if you'd like to share your presentation, and can go from there.
Okay, I'll make sure I pick the correct screen. There we go. Let me know, Elizabeth, when it's popped up.
Yes, popped up. I'll send it live now.
Okay.
Yeah,
good.
So it's there.
Good. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And I just like to. The previous presentation was a really good segue to this presentation, because the changes that have been made to the Environment Protection Act are actually based on the changes that were made to the OHS Act, and a lot of the principles that underpin the OHS Act actually also underpin the Environment Protection Act changes. So, having said that, the General Environmental Duty is something that has been introduced as part of the new Environment Protection Act legislation. Other states do have it, and but it's a new thing for Victoria. So basically, the way I'm going to present this to you is just to present some of the legislation and explain the legislative framework for it, the guiding principles and the things that underpin it, and then I'm going to run through a bit of an example that will bring up the expectations of EPA, and just to explain hopefully the sorts of things that an EPA officer might expect to be looking for when if they happen to want to come and visit your site. So, but before I jump into that, I'll just like to introduce myself a little bit, and also Ricardo. Ricardo hasn't been a large entity in the Victorian consulting world for very long. But the people who comprise it have been in the consulting world for longer than I care to admit to. So we were previously PLC Consulting, and that was a business which was established in 2016. The founding members, of which I'm one, we do have an extensive experience in environmental and engineering consulting with various previous employers. After 20 odd years in the industry, we decided that we could go it alone ourselves, and so we banded together and set up PLC Consulting. Ricardo itself is a UK-based firm, and they approached PLC Consulting last year. We accepted their kind offer, and here we are. So the full name is a bit of a mouthful, Ricardo Energy, Environment and Planning, but just refer to us as Ricardo. It's probably the easiest way all around. So we have, it is a multinational company, so it comes with all the joys of working for a multinat. We also have people in New South Wales and Queensland, but the largest contingent is the former PLC office here in Melbourne. Myself, I have, like I said, over 25 years of experience in environmental consulting. My background is geology, and my working career has mainly been spent in hydrogeology. I have quite a lot of experience in the waste sector, which which has an awful lot in common with the quarries and the extractive industry. So you're dealing with dust, you're dealing with noise, you're dealing with trucks, and there's a lot of things in common. Probably the waste industry has more to do with the EPA than the quarry sector does. So I'm probably relatively well positioned for this presentation today. Anyway, enough about me, and we'll just go on. Right, so the legislative framework. Everyone loves thinking about legislation, but so the original act was 1970, so it was long overdue for a bit of an overhaul, and it was amended in 2017, and then in 2018 there was a whole replacement act that came through. The commencement date for it was originally envisaged for the 1st of July this year, but recently with COVID and various other bits and bobs, they've deferred it for 12 months, which actually is probably a bit of a blessing in disguise, because it gives people a chance to get themselves geared up and ready for the changes. So now I know that everyone on this call is likely to be familiar with the Mineral Resources Act. I'm assuming, given that you're not necessarily quite as conversant with the Environment Protection Act. We will basically, there's a set of regulations that sit underneath the Environment Protection Act. There's a few, but the most relevant one is the Scheduled Premises regulations. The Scheduled Premises regulations basically is the framework for identifying what types of organisations need to have an EPA licence. So they have a schedule at the back that lists a number of different types of industries so if you happen to fall into one of those categories, then you have to have an EPA licence to run your business. There is, under that, a general exemption for businesses that come in under the Mineral Resources Sustainable Development Act. So technically you're off the hook from having to have a licence like most other businesses in Victoria, but it's only for that one clause in those regulations that is the exemption. The other key piece of information that comes in directly underneath the Environment Protection Act is the Environmental Reference Standards. Now, these documents basically set the goals for environmental protection. So they will set the standards for evaluation. They will replace the state environment protection policies that are currently in force there. Underneath that, there's a raft of other guidelines and compliance codes, which EPA is currently frantically drafting, and then that sits on probably a raft of I think my database of other guidance documents is probably about 200 odd documents that sit underneath that. So one of the things that's introduced by this new act is the General Environmental Duty, or the GED. Everything goes by acronyms these days, and this is no different. So it is the definition that's in the act is a person who is engaging in an activity that may give rise to risks of harm to human health or the environment from pollution or waste must minimise those risks so far as reasonably practicable. Now, as you can see, it's a bit subjective. It's more subjective than the requirements under the previous act. The previous act was largely reactive. So if you have an oops and spill something, then they're going to come and they'll be looking to take action against you. Under the new act, they will come and look at you even if you haven't hadn't oops and spilled something, and they will expect you to have measures in place that would prevent it it would prevent that harm happening if you do spill something. So it's very proactive, and it's forward-looking, and it's all about managing the risks. So, I mean, where do you draw the line? I mean, there's that meteorite that just missed us a couple of weeks ago. I mean, how do you protect for that? I mean, I know that's an extreme example, but you know, there's a line. I mean, they're between something that's really obvious to something that's right out of left field. So there needs to be a way of actually defining which risks you actually have to address, and that comes through undertaking a risk assessment. This is a fairly standard approach, and those that have put in a work plan variation recently would be familiar with this process through having to prepare a risk management plan for ERR. So the process is essentially similar. There's just slightly different emphases, but broadly speaking, it's pretty much the same process. So essentially, you're expected to be able to take reasonably practicable steps so to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. So obviously it's preferable to eliminate the risk altogether, but that's not always possible. So there's always something coming out of left field that is an odd circumstance or an exception or something, but you're expected to be able to take reasonable steps to be able to minimize that risk of harm. The other thing that comes through strongly in the new Act is the emphasis on the state of knowledge, in that I didn't realise that this could be a risk is not a defence, essentially. So you need to be able to keep yourself informed, and part of that is looking at so that you can actually keep up to date in what industry expectations are that will allow you to assess the risk and minimise it. So there's a number of different sources where you can seek out that information. So there's the environmental reference standards, which are produced there, which set the overall standards for basically the goals to be achieved and the objectives that need to be met. There's technical notes that are provided by various industry groups or academic institutions. The key thing, of course, that EPA are looking for are the EPA publications. Like I said, there's a guideline for just about everything. I haven't found one for sneezing yet, but I'm sure with COVID it's probably coming fairly quickly. Other government agencies as well, you're expected to be familiar with how they operate. So, excuse me. For example, if your site extends below the water table, that then brings in water authorities and compliance with the Water Act, and you're expected even through the GED that you will seek out the information from your water authority and obtain the necessary approvals to allow you to quarry below water table. There's various other specific industry guidance, and the publications of the CMPA are a great example of that. There are training courses such as this, but sometimes there are specific noise workshops or dust workshops or what have you. There's also various academic sources that are available, the GED expects that you are going to be able to stay current with the state of knowledge of anything that you're going to be dealing with. I might just pause here and see if anybody has any questions on what I have said thus far.
Kathy, there's no questions as of yet.
Okay, is that everyone asleep, or have I completely bamboozled everyone? Anyway, okay, all right. So let's proceed now. So the risk assessment process starts with hazard identification. So crude illustration, you've got a typical extractive industry operation occurring. We need to be able to identify what the risks are, and there's a bit of jargon that goes with all of this. So I'll just go through that briefly, and then we can just identify the sorts of things that might pop up given that situation that we've got on the screen. So a risk is the threat that a hazard poses to a receptor, where a hazard is something such as an object or an activity that has the potential to cause harm. A receptor is something of value that can be harmed. A pathway is the route that the hazard can take to reach the receptor. So in this drawing, sometimes it's easier to work from the back end and build up the picture that way. So if you have a look, and you've probably heard ERR people talking about the receptors that you need to look out for. Obviously, you've got your creek, you've got the ecosystems, so there's the land, there's the trees, there's anything that might live in the water, there's neighbours that are there, there's the air environment, so looking at greenhouse emissions and so forth. Groundwater as well, that's your water table there. Staff who are actually working the equipment, potential receptors, the property itself, so it can be, if there's contamination in the groundwater, it can contaminate other things, so it's where we're starting to get into some of the pathway stuff. Stock as well, they can be supplied with potentially with bore water, so if there's contamination in the groundwater, they can be impacted as well. And I'll tell you what though, if I ever met a sheep that was that big, I think I'd run a mile, even though I do come off a sheep farm originally. Anyway, I reckon that's I'd say a 3-year-old whether on hormones. Anyway, so the risks that the operation may pose, just as from this quick snapshot, obviously noise from the equipment and the trucks, going along the pathway through the air environment to impact the receptor being the residents. So noise will also impact the staff on site, so the staff is also the receptor for noise risks. Dust, similarly, staff on site, dust will also impact vegetation. Dust will obviously impact neighbours as well. Sediment running off from exposed ground can impact the water resources of the creek, which might then in turn also impact anything that uses the water from the creek. You've also got, and obviously it'll also impact the land as well because it will smother things. Contamination, dealing typically with chemicals and fuels. in this industry, probably less of an issue than some of the ones I'm probably more familiar with, but it's still there. So it will typically focus on workshop areas, but also it can extend beyond that if you need to refuel equipment that is out working the pit at the time. So there's lots of so you have to just sort of think about everything that you do in the day and think, if something went wrong, what would happen? So geotechnical risks, which is, I guess, illustrated a little bit from the edges of the face. So a geotechnical, a collapse of some sort would then also generate sediment risks, as well as, well, probably a dust only for a little bit period of time, but maybe there'd be dust generated from time taking to remediate the said geotechnical collapse. So the hazards itself, we've been working backwards, comes to the actual activities that you're doing on the site. So that would be the excavation and the loading, and for the contamination, the maintenance activities that are there, and pathways are obviously how one gets from A to B. So what is then required is, once you've actually started to tune in to think about how your operations work, build up a risk register. And I've only taken one aspect here, because if I went through everything that is shown in this picture, we might be here all day, and I think everyone probably wants lunch at some point. So taking the example of just the activity of loading the product. So you've got your hazard is loading product. The source is actually the front end loader, that's the equipment. Now it generates a number of different risks. So it will generate noise, which will travel through the air environment to impact neighbours, or it will travel through the air environment to impact staff. You've got dust that will do likewise, and you've got sediment from the ground disturbing and off stockpiles and so on, through the air environment, or well, actually that should be the water environment. Anyway, into the creek, and also to impact potentially the ecosystems within it. So within that snapshot as well, there's a whole heap of other different things that could be drawn up from just that particular little snapshot. So just from that one area, I think you can see that it doesn't take very much before you've actually got quite a long list of risks. Sometimes they can be 50 to 100 type long, and it does get challenging to know how far do you go, because it seems that if there's always another angle that you hadn't thought of. You think, all right, I've got them all, but then someone comes up and suggests something else, and you think, oh well, actually that probably ought to be in there as well. So it can grow a little bit, but if the expectation is there that you will have comprehensively assessed the risks that are there. So once you've got your risk register, what's the next step in the process? So those who have prepared an ERR risk management plan would be familiar with the idea of a risk assessment matrix. So it's based on an assessment of likelihood and consequence. So taking the likelihood, you have a range of different likelihoods to choose from, and similarly on consequence. So if you have got something that is likely to occur and it's going to have a significant impact, you're going to come out with a very high risk. So V is very high, H is high, M is medium, and L is low. There are a number of different versions of this, but the principle is pretty much the same. There are in the ERR guidance, there's another table in the work plan variation guidelines, which actually puts some criteria on those categories to allow you to evaluate how likely it is. So it might be, could occur once in 10 years or whatever, that sort of thing. The consequence categories that ERR rely on are a lot more detailed than those that are used by EPA, and they're actually a lot more sector specific. So the ERR ones go into more detail about, they'll have separate criteria for environmental hazard, or for water hazards versus community engagement hazards versus a whole heap of other categories. So under the Act, it doesn't say you have to, the EP Act, Environment Protection Act, you're not bound to use the matrix that they have provided. It is very close to the one that ERR use, and my view would be, if you have to go through this process for ERR, just make sure you've covered off on the risks that EPA will be looking for, and then you'll have one document that will fulfill both purposes. So for the noise environment, essentially, actually something I should have mentioned before is that the way the risk is assessed is that you assess it first just based on your inherent risk. And while EPA don't spell it out as clearly as ERR do, there's the assumption that you will assess it first without the control measures, and then secondly after the control measures, so that you can actually see how you've got some form of measure about the effectiveness of how you're actually managing that risk. But the first assessment is the inherent risk. So if you did nothing to mitigate it, so you're talking about noise, so there was no noise buns or anything like that around there, the neighbours would probably hear it. They're a distance away, so maybe the consequence might be minor. Therefore, and utilising the matrix that we saw on the previous slide, that would come up with a level of risk being medium. So you would work then through the process. So once again, noise, the staff are a lot closer to the source, so they're probably it's more likely that they're going to have potential impacts. And if they haven't got any control measures, that's no PPE or anything like that, then they'd probably have a significant impact on their health. So the risk would be very high. Similarly for dust, there might be some factors that might need to come into play before neighbours are going to be impacted, such as wind directions and so on and so forth. And there, once again, distance would be in your favour there, so the impact of the dust might come out to be low. So I guess one of the things is that this just follows through with the thinking through about what you're doing and the context of your site within the surrounds. So we're thinking, once again, just keeping in mind where the receptors are and so on. Stormwater runoff, I've got it right in this slide. So the sediment one was stormwater runoff goes into the creek without any control measures. It probably will go into the creek, but it's a relatively small operation, so it might end up just being a fairly minor impact, which once again would lead to medium. There might not be, the creek might not run very often, so there might be very few ecosystems which are sensitive that might be in that area. So maybe they're not going to be too badly impacted by some of the sediment that's coming in. So their inherent risk would be low. So as with ERR, EPA are going to be looking at what you're doing on the site and focusing in on the very high risks that would come in very high and high. And they would be expecting that you would have measures in place that would reduce the level of risk to medium and low. Okay, so then you have to think about, okay, well, what controls do we need to put into place for each of those risks? So obviously the best thing is to do something just to remove the risk altogether. That's obviously the best option. Following that, there's the controls that you can put in. Engineering controls are preferred over administrative controls. I guess if you have administrative controls are reliant on people doing the right thing and following procedures and things, whereas if you have built it in a certain way, it's done and it's engineered and it's sorted a little easier. So it's based on I guess the reliability of the control. Obviously elimination's the best. So yeah, so that's the sort of guiding principles that underpin the controls side of things. So, okay, so really the control measures is just a list of what you're going to commit to do. So I'm just focusing in on just a noise at the moment. This is the sorts of control measures that you might expect to put into place. So from that, and I'm just playing out with the noise one at the moment. So under this, so we've got our inherent risk that we started off with. So once all those measures have been put into place, then the likelihood that that neighbours are going to be impacted would reduce from medium to low, and the likelihood would also drop for staff. So you've got, no, I don't know if did I put PPE on the list? I don't think I did, but that's an obvious one. But once you've got those measures, there's also some checks and balances that both EPA and ERR like to see, just to make sure that you've actually got a measure that, yeah, it's installed properly and that's how it's to run. Some of those are extracted from ERR's sort of standard list of controls. So once again, I guess one of the key points that I'm making is that if you're following what ERR would normally want, you will also meet the requirements of the GED. So the final element, of course, in doing in the risk management process is to have the monitoring in place. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you've done the right thing, because both an ERR inspector or an EPA inspector, they don't know if when they step onto your property, whether or not you've been doing the right thing and whether you've actually thought all this through. So you do need to have the documents prepared that you can show them to demonstrate that, yeah, I've really thought this through. So you also need to be able to demonstrate that the control measures that you've put in place are actually working. So for that, you need to have a monitoring program. The monitoring program, there's usually a couple of different ways to tackle that. Part of it is obviously through day-to-day activities. You know, you do your own inspections when you boot up. You check just like you check the oil and fuel levels before you turn on a piece of equipment. There's also the checks and balances that you need on other controls that you've got. So, for example, for stormwater, a sediment trap is not going to work very well if it's completely clogged with stuff. So you need to have a program whereby, say, once a week you go through and you check your sediment traps, or just to eyeball them or clean them out, maintenance as well. Just make sure that your controls are working quite well. So there's a lot. Most of the potential impacts and risks can be monitored just by observations on site. So if there's a howling northerly, just you would make an observation and note, yep, today had a howling northerly, and there was dust that was being generated, was treated with a water cart, and confirmed that this did actually reduce the risk. And if EPA can see that you have done that checking and you've documented it, then that would satisfy them. It's all part of just trying to be proactive and to manage the risks that your operations have. So there's the internal reporting. Look, most of the site inspections and stuff, it sounds onerous, and there's probably a few thinking, well, who'd go to all that freaking effort? But a lot of it can be streamlined just through checklists and bits and pieces. So you just have a weekly inspection checklist that you can just go around and say, yep, stormwater drains have been ticked, yep, there's enough freeboard in the ponds, yep, tick. And then put that away for as part of your site reporting. It just becomes a standard part of the way you do business. So that's where you've got your internal reporting and your inspections and so forth. The periodic monitoring is typically more specialized. So you might need to just get it, okay, I'm going back to my roots, groundwater. So some sites would be required to have some monitoring bores just to check levels, particularly if you are dewatering on a site. One of the risks would probably be, are we going to drop the groundwater level to the point that it dries up the neighbour's bores? So for that, you would probably be required to put in a bore somewhere in between so that you can check the amount of drawdown that you are putting on the water table, and therefore confirm that your neighbour is not being impacted by the dewatering that's going on your site. So something like that might require more specialist sampling and laboratory analysis to demonstrate that there isn't an impact. Surface water samples as well. Labs, and there are wave the flag for consultants as well, could help you out with that sort of stuff. The dust deposition gauges is another one, which I know a lot of sites already have installed. Just write those make sure they're written into your monitoring program. You're probably already doing a lot of the stuff that is expected. Where the gaps I think are likely to be is that you just haven't got it documented. Obviously, to complete that feedback process into your risk assessment, need to have a look and then evaluate the results that are there, make sure your control measures are working. And then once you know that your control measures are working, then you can go back and just check and say, well, did I actually assess the level of residual risk accurately? So it becomes an iterative process, which as your quarry extends further, the level of risk may change because you might be moving closer to another receptor. So you need to revisit the level of assessed risk as well. So yeah, I'll just pause again for any questions.
There's just one question, Kathy. It's around having staff as a receptor. ERR looks after the risks posed to neighbours through the risk management plan, which is in line with the new legislation.
Yep.
How are the risks to staff managed, given that health and safety of staff is looked after by WorkSafe?
Yeah, there is a bit of overlap. EPA's mandate is looking after human health and the environment, so there's a bit of overlap there. So given that that they're both the OH&S Act and the Environment Protection Act are both based on this concept of a general duty. Obviously, the EP Act is a general environmental duty, but their mandate is always human health and the environment. So usually when there's the guidelines, the environmental reference standards are developed with a human health bent a lot of the time. So, for example, once again going back to the groundwater one, it's in terms of beneficial use. So can the groundwater be used for stock purposes? Can it be used for irrigation? Can it be used for potable? So there's that coming back and bringing in the human element of it as well. So when you do your dust study that would then confirm that you're going to be meeting the guideline documents, that is automatically taking into account that you've got your human health covered off, because the guidelines themselves are designed to protect human impact. So if you're meeting those guidelines, then by default you're protecting your the people as well as the environment. So yeah, I don't know if does that help?
The follow-up was, will quarries require risk management plans to address risk posed to staff?
The risk management plans, yes, do that ERR require do it also cover off on human health risks, and certainly the risk management plans I've been preparing have identified risks to staff as well. It is acknowledged that it primarily comes under the OH&S Act, but given that you're dealing with human receptors, and just because they're staff doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, you've also got to deal with the human receptors that are living in the neighbouring property as well. So staff and neighbours, their health is a receptor.
Okay.
The short answer is yes.
The other question is, which you might not know the answer to, is with the new legislation coming in place next year, is there a grace period for sites to implement new practices and requirements?
There is for existing EPA license holders. They will have to a point that they're expected to have this under control anyway. So if I can just quickly switch hats. So landfills are required to already have their risk assessment and management plan in place, and that's been for the last 10 years they've been required to have that in place. Some of the other industries that are scheduled haven't had the same level of rigour, so there's probably a few that haven't done it. The guidance, that the EPA guidelines that are under the current Act have typically been in force and expected for about the last 10 years. But what the main thing was, it didn't have the strength of the legislation overarching over the top of that to actually force people to do that. So while it's been expected, and people will get growled at for not having done it currently, under the new Act, there will be legislative tools that EPA can then use to enforce that. I think in reality, EPA will provide a grace period. The time to put one of these together, though, for most operations, it's not a 2-year process. I would think that most organisations would be able to get it in place before the 1st of July next year, now that deadline has been extended. So, but I still reckon there probably will be a bit of a grace period, but it's not formally stated because they want everyone to come online as quickly as they can. Does that help?
Thank you, Kathy.
Okay, all right. Okay, so just moving on to the tail end of it. Now, for those, before I just jump in there, I note that for those that are operating in accordance with the Code of Practice with ERR, they're not required to have a risk management plan because the code is their risk management plan. At least that's ERR's understanding. So it would probably be advisable for those that are running under the code to actually have a document that runs through this risk assessment process to demonstrate that they are acting in accordance with the Environment Protection Act, just to I guess to formalise the fact that you are doing the right thing. So if you happen to have some sites are really lucky, they have an EPA license as well as a work authority. Those sites that already have a license under the EP Act, they are typically for sites that have off-site discharges. So if you are discharging processed water from your site to a creek, then that will typically be licensed under the Scheduled Premises Act. So there is a requirement to specifically address some of those measures. They have the licenses, the risk management plan that comes for those with licenses includes a slightly higher level of detail than what's required for those that aren't licensed by EPA. And I've put down on that list there some of the additional requirements that would form supporting documentation to your risk management plan. So something like your conceptual site model would require an understanding and documentation of the geology and groundwater that underpins your site. So your description of your environmental setting would include a description of neighbouring watercourses, where your neighbours are, your receptors. Other stakeholders might be, if some sites, if they had a community reference group or something like that. So it's slightly broader than a strict just risk management plan like you would need to do for a quarry site licensed by ERR. For the water discharge licenses, there was a new requirement for those licensees that was brought in, I don't know, probably 18 months ago now, that you need to have a mixing zone model so that you can demonstrate that, you know, where you're discharging water into your creek, that that you're not impacting on the ecology of that creek. So it involves working out where the zone is mixing and evaluating, having measures there to assess any receptors that might potentially be impacted from it. So yeah, so there's a little bit more involved for those sites, but the overall process is essentially the same. So in summary, I guess just reiterating, if you're already working under an ERR risk management plan, you're required to have your hazard identification and your risk register. You're required to have your risk evaluation done, so that's your risk matrix with assessing the level of risk. You're required to have your controls, and you're required to have your monitoring and reporting strategies in place. If you've got those in place, then in my view, this would also satisfy the EPA expectations for the GED. So yeah, I guess I'd just like to open it up if there's any further questions.
No further questions have come up, Kathy. I'd like to thank you very much for your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay.
Okay. All right, I shall take my screen, stop sharing my screen. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone. I'd just like to thank you for participating in this webinar. I hope it's been of some use to you. We'll ensure that the presentations get emailed out to all participants. And if you have any comments or would like further topics to be aired, just let us know. Thank you very much. I'm ending the session now.